Hey there, welcome to Dread Lullabies. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. You know, they say the night is for resting, but for some, the darkness is where the real world begins. Tonight, I've put together a few true stories that are meant to be heard in the quiet. Stories that remind us that sometimes the things that go bump in the night are more real than we'd like to believe. Before we get lost in the dark, I'd love to know where you're joining me from. So feel free to drop a comment and tell me where you're listening tonight. And if you find yourself coming back for more, maybe consider liking the video and subscribing. It really helps me keep these lullabies going for you. So, pull up the covers, get comfortable, and let's see what the night has in store for us. My grandmother's house has always felt different from any other place I've been. It isn't just old in the usual sense. It feels like it carries time inside it, like the walls have been quietly holding on to everything that has ever happened there. The house was built sometime in the late 1700s, and the moment you step onto the property, you can feel that age in a way that's hard to explain. The floors creak in certain spots, not randomly, but almost like they remember where people used to walk. The layout isn't quite like modern homes either. Some rooms feel slightly off, like they were built for a different way of living, a different rhythm of life. During the day, it feels calm, peaceful even, but at night, everything changes just enough that you notice it. The silence becomes deeper, the shadows feel thicker. And there's this stillness that settles into the air, like the house itself is resting but still aware. What makes it even more unusual is what surrounds it. There are graveyards on both sides of the property, not far away, not hidden behind trees or tucked away down a road. They're right there, close enough that you can step into them within seconds of leaving the house. The headstones are old, worn down by time and weather. Some lean slightly to one side, others are barely standing at all. A few look like they've been slowly sinking into the ground over the years. When you grow up around something like that, it stops feeling strange. It becomes normal. You see the graveyards every day, and eventually, they just blend into the background of your life. You don't think about who is buried there. You don't think about how long they've been there. You just accept it as part of the environment. That's how it was for me, until that day. A friend of mine came over. I hadn't seen him in months. He had been away going through a drug treatment program, dealing with things I didn't fully understand at the time. When he showed up, he seemed different. Not in a bad way. He wasn't acting strange or unstable. If anything, he felt calmer than before. But there was something else too, something harder to describe. It was like he had gone through something that shifted the way he saw the world. The way he spoke was slower, more deliberate. The way he looked at things felt more focused, like he was paying attention to details most people ignore. We started walking down the old cobblestone driveway, just talking. At some point, now he started opening up about what he had been through. Not in a dramatic or emotional way, but in a quiet, thoughtful kind of way. He talked about feeling more aware now, more connected, like something in his mind had changed. He said it felt like he was tuned in, not in a religious sense, not like he had suddenly found some belief system or was trying to convince me of anything. It was more personal than that. He described it like he could sense things he never noticed before, like there were layers to the world that he had been blind to, and now he could pick up on them. I listened to him, and honestly, I believed that something had changed in him. You could see it in the way he carried himself. It didn't feel fake or exaggerated. It felt real, whatever it was. We kept walking, talking about random things in between, when my cat came up to us. She brushed against my leg the way she always did, slow and familiar. Her tail curled slightly as she moved, her body pressing lightly against me. It didn't seem unusual at first. She was affectionate like that sometimes. I reached down without thinking, letting her stay close as we continued our conversation. But then I noticed something. She didn't stop. Normally, she would rub against my leg once or twice and then wander off. That's just how she was, but this time, she kept coming back. Again and again. Every time I tried to ignore it, she pressed against me harder, more insistently. At first I thought she just wanted attention, but after a while it felt different, like she wanted something specific. I looked down at her, trying to figure out what she was doing, and that's when she moved. She walked a few steps ahead, then stopped, turned around, looked directly at me. When I didn't move, she came back, rubbed against my leg again, then turned and walked forward. That's when it became clear. She wanted me to follow her. I hesitated for a second. It felt strange, but not enough to stop me, so I started walking behind her. My friend followed too, quiet now, watching everything. Every time I slowed down or stopped, she came back to me, rubbed against my leg, then turned and led the way again. Step by step, she guided us forward, and then I realized where we were heading, the graveyard. The moment that thought formed in my mind, something shifted. It wasn't something I could see or hear clearly, but it was enough to make me more aware of everything around me. The quiet felt deeper. The air felt heavier. The whole place seemed to settle into a different kind of stillness. But we kept walking. Neither of us said anything. We just followed her. She didn't stop until we reached one of the headstones. And then she did something I had never seen her do before. She jumped up onto it, not just onto the base, but onto the narrow, upright part of the gravestone itself. She balanced there in a way that didn't even look comfortable. Her body was steady, her posture alert, her eyes fixed on something we couldn't see. And then she stayed there, completely still. At first, we just stood there, watching, waiting for her to move. But she didn't. She didn't shift her weight, didn't jump down, didn't break her focus. It was like she was locked onto something, completely absorbed in whatever she was sensing. I stepped closer, she slowly reaching out to pick her up. The moment I got close, she hissed, loud, sharp, the kind of hiss that makes you pull your hand back instantly. It wasn't playful. It wasn't even just defensive in a normal way. It felt aggressive. Like she didn't want to be touched, like she didn't want to leave that spot. I stepped back. We looked at each other for a second, neither of us saying anything. Then we both looked at the gravestone, really looked at it, the name, the dates. And that's when we realized something that made everything feel heavier. The person buried there had lived in my grandmother's house, not nearby, not just in the same area, in that exact house. The same place we had just come from. That realization sat between us. It changed the moment, the way my cat had come to us, the way she insisted we follow her, the way she led us directly to that specific grave, and then the way she stayed there, refusing to leave. It didn't feel random anymore. My friend quietly took out his phone and snapped a picture of her, still balanced on the headstone, still completely focused on something we couldn't see. We didn't talk much after that. We just stood there for a few more seconds, taking it in. Eventually, my cat jumped down on her own, just like that. No hesitation, no resistance. She walked back toward the house, like nothing had happened, like it had all been completely normal. We followed her back slowly, neither of us saying much. The conversation we had been having earlier stayed in the back of my mind, about being tuned in, about sensing things, about awareness. The timing of everything made it harder to ignore. Back at the house, everything felt normal again, the same familiar space, the same quiet. But something about the moment stayed with me. Even now, when I think about it, I remember how clear everything felt. The way she kept coming back to guide me, the stillness of the graveyard, the way she stood on that headstone like she belonged there. I still don't know what to make of it. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe animals notice things we don't. Or maybe it was just a strange coincidence that happened to line up in a way that felt meaningful. But standing there, in that moment, it didn't feel like coincidence. It felt intentional, like something had drawn us there. And for those few minutes, it felt like we were exactly where we were supposed to be, even if we never understood why. My mother-in-law was the kind of person people naturally gravitated toward. She had this easy warmth about her, the kind that made conversations feel effortless. She joked a lot, laughed easily, and never made things feel heavy, even when life was. Being around her just felt comfortable. And more than anything, she and my wife had a bond that was impossible to miss. It wasn't just that they were close, it was deeper than that. The kind of connection where they understood each other without needing to say much. When she passed away, it left a hole that didn't really go away. It hit my wife especially hard, and what made it more difficult was the timing. Our son was only about 4 months old when it happened. Too young to remember her, too young to have any real sense of who she was. He would grow up only hearing stories, seeing pictures, learning about her secondhand. At least, that's what we thought. A few years went by after that. We were living in an old craftsman house in Pasadena. It had that classic look, built sometime in the 1930s. Wooden floors that creaked in certain spots. Older fixtures that had clearly been there for decades. And a quiet character that newer houses just don't have. It never felt creepy or unsettling. If anything, it felt grounded, lived in, like it had history, but nothing about it ever made us uncomfortable. By then, our son was around 3 years old enough to talk clearly, to play on his own, to have little moments of imagination like any kid his age. Everything about him felt normal. There were no signs of anything strange. Just a regular child growing up in a regular home. One night, I was giving him a bath. It was one of those simple, everyday moments. Warm water, a couple of toys floating around, him splashing lightly while I kept an eye on him. Nothing unusual. I was mostly focused on making sure he didn't get water all over the floor. That's when I noticed something. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking over my shoulder. At first, I didn't think much of it. Kids get distracted all the time. They stare at random things, follow shadows, notice details adults ignore. But there was something about the way he was looking. It wasn't casual, it wasn't random. It felt focused, like he was actually looking at something. I stayed still for a second, thinking maybe he'd snap out of it or say something unrelated. But he didn't look away. A few seconds passed, and then he spoke. He asked me why Grandma calls Mommy a funny name. For a moment, I didn't fully process what he had said. It took a second for it to land. My first instinct was to assume he meant my mom. That would at least make some sense. So I asked him what he meant. And then he said it again. This time he repeated the name. The nickname. The one my mother-in-law used for my wife. The one almost no one else used. That was the moment everything stopped feeling normal. It wasn't a name we used in our home. Not in conversation, not jokingly, not even in passing. It was something personal between my wife and her mother. Something that had been part of their relationship for years. Something tied to childhood and family. Something that didn't exist in our daily life anymore. There was no reason our son should have known it. I asked him where he heard that, and he answered immediately, like it was the simplest question in the world. The farmer told me. That didn't make anything better. If anything, it made it worse. I asked him who the farmer was. He didn't hesitate. My friend. That was all he said. No confusion, no attempt to explain further. Just my friend, like that was enough. And the way he said it, it didn't feel like imagination. It didn't feel like he was making something up. It felt normal to him, like he was talking about someone real. I didn't push him too much after that. He went right back to playing in the water like nothing had happened, like the conversation we just had was completely ordinary, but it stayed with me. That name, that answer, that calm certainty in his voice. Later that night, I told my wife. The moment I said the nickname out loud, her reaction was immediate. It hit her emotionally in a way I could see right away. That name wasn't just a word. It was something tied to her mother, something personal, something that carried memories. And hearing that our son had said it, it brought all of that back. We sat there trying to figure it out, going over possibilities, trying to find some explanation that made sense. But nothing did. There was no way he could have picked it up. No conversations we could point to. No situation where he might have overheard it. Eventually, we didn't have anywhere else to go with it, so we just let it sit. We told ourselves if it happened again, we'd deal with it then. About a week passed. Then something else happened. It was the weekend. My wife was at work, and I was home with our son. Everything felt normal. He was in his room playing, doing his usual thing, talking to himself here and there like kids do. Then I heard him talking. But this wasn't the usual kind of talking. It wasn't random sounds or one-sided chatter. It sounded like a conversation. There were pauses, responses, little breaks in between, like he was listening and then answering. I could hear him say things like, "Yes, no, I don't know that," and then laugh. It felt real, too real. I walked down the hallway slowly and stepped into his room. He was sitting on the floor, playing like nothing was unusual. I asked him what he was doing. He said, "Playing." I asked who he was playing with. He looked up at me, completely calm. The farmer. That same name, that same certainty. I felt that uneasy feeling again, stronger this time. I tried to keep my voice steady and asked him where the farmer was. And he said something I still think about. "He left when you came in." The way he said it, it didn't feel like imagination. It felt like a simple observation, like someone had actually been there and then left. I didn't know what to say after that. I stayed in the room for a bit, watching him, listening, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. He just kept playing like normal. Later, when my wife came home, I told her everything. Now it wasn't just one moment anymore. It was a pattern. We both felt it. That quiet, creeping feeling that something didn't add up. We didn't want to overreact. We didn't want to scare ourselves or each other. But at the same time, we couldn't ignore it. We agreed that if it happened again, we would figure out what to do. A few days passed. Then one night, in the middle of the night, we both heard something. Our son's voice coming from his room. He was talking again, but this time it was clearer, louder. We could actually understand what he was saying. "Grandma says you and I can't be friends anymore." We both froze. Neither of us spoke for a second. Then we looked at each other, and without saying anything, we both got up and walked to his room. He was sitting up in bed, awake, not scared, not confused, just sitting there like he had been having a conversation. I asked him if he was okay. He said yes. Then he said something we both remember exactly. "Grandma says I can't play with the farmer anymore." That was it. No emotion, no fear, just a simple statement, like he was repeating something he had been told. After that night, everything stopped. Completely. No more mentions of the farmer, no more conversations, no more strange comments. It was like it had never happened at all. As he grew older, we didn't bring it up much. We didn't want to influence his memory or put ideas into his head. Eventually, when he was old enough, we asked him about it. He didn't remember anything, nothing at all. To him, it was like that entire period didn't exist. But for us, it never went away. We remember every detail, the way he said the nickname, the calmness in his voice, the conversations, and the way it all ended so suddenly. We've tried to explain it over the years, tried to find something logical, something that fits, but nothing ever feels complete. And that's what makes it stay with you, not just what happened, but how real it felt, how specific it was, how it started, and how it ended. Something appeared in our lives for a short time, something our son somehow knew, and then, just like that, it was gone. I've heard a lot of scary stories over the years, but the ones that stay with me the most are never about something supernatural. They're the ones that come from real moments, real memories, the kind that don't disappear when you wake up, because they were never dreams to begin with. The kind that stay with you, settle somewhere deep, and then show up again later in ways you don't expect. Right after I graduated high school, something happened that changed everything for me. It started like a normal morning. I woke up without thinking much about anything, still half asleep, just moving through the routine the way you always do. There was nothing unusual about how the day began. No warning, no feeling that anything was wrong. I got up and walked toward the living room, and that's when everything changed. I found my father. He was already gone. That moment didn't hit all at once. It came in pieces. At first, it didn't fully register. Your brain tries to protect you from something like that. It looks for other explanations, anything that makes it less real. But there was no mistaking it. I rushed to him. I tried CPR. I did everything I could think of. Everything you're supposed to do in that situation. Movements that felt automatic, desperate, like if I just did them right, something would change. But it didn't. He was already dead. That moment stayed with me in a way I couldn't control. It didn't just pass like a bad day or a difficult memory. It stuck. It rooted itself somewhere deep, and it followed me. Almost immediately after that, the nightmares started. Not the kind that fade when you wake up. Not the kind you forget after a few minutes. These were the same exact moment, over and over again. In the dream, I would be walking toward the living room. Everything would feel normal at first, just like it had that morning. The same quiet, the same space, the same steps. But right before I reached it, something inside me would realize what I was about to see. And that's when the dread would hit. Heavy, overwhelming, so strong that I wouldn't even make it into the room. I would start screaming before I got there, every time. And then I would wake up already screaming in real life. It kept happening, night after night. It got to the point where I stopped sleeping. I would stay awake as long as I possibly could, just to avoid going back into that moment. Days blurred together. I wasn't functioning normally anymore. Everything revolved around not letting myself fall asleep. That went on for about a year. Then one day something different happened. It wasn't at night. It was in the middle of the day. According to my girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife, my body suddenly locked up. She said I tensed up like I was having a seizure, and it lasted for about an hour. From the outside, I was there physically, but not really present. Inside my head, I was somewhere else. I was back in that moment again, but this time, it didn't stop. I kept reliving that morning over and over again, like I was stuck in a loop. Every time I got close to the living room, I would stop myself. That same scream would come out, the same one from my nightmares, and everything would reset. Again, and again, and again. Each time I refused to go all the way through it, but it didn't end. It just kept repeating. There was no way out of it as long as I kept stopping, until eventually something in me gave out, or maybe something in me finally accepted it. I stopped resisting. I let myself walk into the living room. I let myself see him, and when I did, something broke inside me, or maybe something released. When I came out of it, everything was quiet again, and after that day, the nightmares stopped. Just like that. They didn't come back the way they had before. For the first time in a long time, I could sleep without expecting to relive that moment. For a while, it felt like I had finally gotten past it. like whatever had been holding on to me had finally let go. Then years later, something else happened. In 2005, I joined the Army. Eventually, I ended up in Iraq, leading a convoy. That environment was completely different, but the tension was always there. You were always alert, always aware that something could go wrong at any moment. Every decision mattered, every second mattered. We had been warned about certain situations, insurgents using children, sending them into the road in front of vehicles, forcing soldiers into decisions no one should have to make. We were told clearly what to do. If someone stepped into the road, you didn't stop, because stopping could get everyone killed. It sounded simple when it was explained, but reality isn't simple. One day, it happened. I was driving, focused on the road ahead, when a kid suddenly ran out in front of my vehicle. Not far, too close. Close enough that I had to react immediately, and I froze. Everything I had been told, every rule, every instruction was there in my head, but in that moment, it didn't feel like a rule. It felt like a choice. My truck chief was yelling at me, telling me to go, telling me to floor it. Everything inside me resisted, but I did it. I pressed down and kept going. At the last second, the kid moved. He got out of the way, and just like that, it was over. Nothing happened, but it didn't feel over, because something had already started inside me. When we reached the next FOB, I tried to rest, but my mind wouldn't settle. I kept replaying the moment, thinking about how close it had been, thinking about what could have happened if things had gone differently. Eventually, I fell asleep, and the dream came back, but it wasn't the same anymore. This time, I was driving again. Same road, same situation. The kid ran out in front of me, but this time, he didn't move. This time, I ran him over. The impact felt real, immediate. I stopped the vehicle, the realization hitting all at once. I got out to check, and as I walked around the truck, that feeling came back. That same dread, the exact same one from years before. And somehow, in the dream, I recognized it. I told myself this wasn't the same. I told myself it was different. But the feeling didn't care. It was exactly the same. I kept walking. I reached the back of the truck. And what I saw wasn't the kid. It was my father, lying there, exactly the way I had found him. Everything hit at once, the past and the present collapsing into the same moment. And I let out that same scream, the same one from all those nights. Only this time, I didn't wake up slowly. I woke up running, already moving, full speed. I don't even remember the exact moment I came out of the dream. I just remember being awake and already sprinting, like my body had reacted before my mind even knew what was happening. I ended up somewhere inside the FOB that I didn't recognize at first. It took time for everything to settle. After that, the nightmares stopped again. But something stayed. Not fear of something outside. Fear of my own mind. Because those moments showed me something I couldn't ignore. That even when you think you've moved past something, it doesn't mean it's gone. It can come back. In a different form. At a different time. And even now I think about that sometimes. Not constantly. Not in a way that controls my life. But enough to remind me that the things we go through don't just disappear. Sometimes they wait. And when they come back, they don't always look the same, but they feel the same. And that's what makes them stay with you.
When I look back on that time now, I still don't have a clear answer for what actually happened. I've tried to explain it to myself in different ways. Tried to break it down into smaller pieces that make more sense. But the way everything unfolded, step by step, made it feel like something else entirely in the moment. It started out as nothing more than curiosity. I had recently come across stories about skinwalkers, and instead of brushing them off like I normally would with things like that, I got pulled in completely. It wasn't just a passing interest. It turned into something I thought about constantly. I started reading everything I could find, going through stories, forums, explanations, people's experiences, even the debates about whether any of it could be real. It didn't matter what side it came from. If it was connected, I read it. The more I read, the more it stuck in my head. It became something I talked about without even realizing how often I was bringing it up. I mentioned it to friends, brought it up at home, joked about it, thought about it before going to sleep. It followed me around in a way that felt harmless at the time, like any other interest that just happens to take over your attention for a while. Didn't think about the idea that some people believe you shouldn't talk about things like that, especially not late at night. To me, it was just a story, something strange and dark, but still just a story. Then one night, something changed. I had just gotten into bed. It was late and the house had that deep, quiet stillness that only comes when everyone else is asleep. I'd recently moved back home from college, so I was still getting used to being there again. Everything felt familiar, but at the same time, slightly different, like I hadn't fully settled back into it yet. I was lying there, not fully asleep, just in that space where your thoughts start to slow down. That's when I heard it, a tapping sound. At first, it didn't mean anything to me. There was a tree branch near my window, and it wasn't unusual for it to brush against the glass when the wind picked up. I didn't even sit up. I just lay there, assuming it was the same thing, something small and normal. But it didn't stop. The tapping continued, and then it changed. It got louder, more distinct. What had started as a soft, irregular sound turned into something sharper, more deliberate. It didn't sound like a branch anymore. It sounded like something hitting the window with intention. Almost there was a rhythm to it, not perfectly even, but consistent enough to feel purposeful. I remember staring into the darkness of my room, completely still, just listening. That's when the feeling started. That quiet sense that something isn't right. It wasn't panic yet. It was something slower, something that builds before your mind catches up with it. And then everything broke at once. My little brother screamed. It was loud and sudden, the kind of scream that doesn't give you time to think before you react. It wasn't just fear, it was panic. The kind that makes your whole body move before you even understand what's happening. I jumped out of bed immediately and ran toward his room. At the same time, I could hear my parents doing the same thing. Doors opening, footsteps moving fast down the hallway. When we got to him, he was sitting there, crying, completely shaken. He was trying to talk, but the words were coming out uneven, broken by how upset he was. It took a few seconds for him to get it out clearly. He said he saw men outside the house, looking in through my window. That was the moment everything inside me shifted. The tapping, his scream, what he said. It all connected instantly. My dad didn't waste any time. He went straight to his room, grabbed the gun he kept under the bed, and started checking the house. He went outside, walked around the property, checked the yard, the sides of the house, anywhere someone could have been hiding. There was nothing. No footprints, no movement, no sign that anyone had been there at all. It was like whatever my brother had seen and whatever had been tapping on my window had simply disappeared. Eventually, things calmed down. My brother stopped crying, though he still looked shaken. My parents tried to reassure him, telling him it was probably nothing, that he was safe, that everything was okay. The house went quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. it felt different, tighter, like something had happened that none of us could explain, and we were all just trying to move past it without saying too much. That night, I didn't really sleep. Every sound made me alert. Every small movement in the house felt amplified. I kept thinking about the tapping, about how it had changed, about how it didn't sound like a branch anymore. And I kept thinking about what my brother said. Men, standing outside, looking into my window. The image stayed in my head no matter how much I tried to push it away. After that, things seemed to go back to normal. Days passed. Nothing else happened. No more tapping, no more strange sounds. No one saw anything outside. But the feeling didn't fully leave. It just settled into the background. Then about a week later, something happened that brought it all back in a way that felt even worse. One of my friends from high school came over. He had been away at a different college, so we hadn't seen each other in a while. We decided to go out and grab something to eat, just something simple, nothing serious. My little brother came along with us. We ended up at McDonald's, sitting there with our food, talking like everything was normal again. At some point, my friend brought up that night. He asked my brother if he had seen those guys again. My brother answered immediately. He said yes. That alone was enough to make me tense. But then he kept talking. He said he was used to seeing them now, that they told him they wouldn't hurt him. And then he said something that stayed with me more than anything else. He said they were waiting for me, that they stood outside, looking into my window every night. The way he said it was calm, completely calm. He wasn't scared. He wasn't trying to get attention. He spoke like he was describing something normal, something he had accepted. That's what made it worse. If he had been afraid, it would have been easier to dismiss. Kids imagine things. They exaggerate. They let their fears take shape in ways that don't make sense to adults. But he didn't sound like that. He sounded certain. None of us really knew what to say. We kind of laughed it off. Also the way people do when something feels too strange to sit with seriously. But inside, it didn't feel like a joke. I kept going back to that night. The tapping, the scream, my dad finding nothing. And now this. Even now, I don't know what to make of it. Maybe it was all coincidence. Maybe the tapping really was just a branch hitting the window in a strange pattern. Maybe my brother's mind filled in the rest. Maybe everything lined up in a way that made it feel bigger than it actually was. But at the time, it didn't feel like that. It felt like something had noticed that I had been talking about things I didn't understand. And for a while after that, every night when I lay in bed, I found myself listening. Just a little more closely, waiting to hear that tapping again. When I was younger, I studied at a Jesuit boarding school in the foothills of the Kathmandu Valley. It was one of those places that felt peaceful during the day, surrounded by hills and quiet landscapes. But at night, it changed into something else, entirely. The silence would stretch out, and every little sound felt bigger than it should have. The school had a very clear structure when it came to living arrangements. The younger kids, from grades 1 to 4, all stayed together in one large building. It was long, crowded, and always full of noise, which in a strange way made it feel safer. You were never really alone there. There was always someone talking, laughing, and moving around. But once you reached grade 5, things changed. We were moved into smaller buildings, almost like little bungalows. It felt like a step up, or like we were being trusted with more independence. The bungalow assigned to grade 5 was old but beautiful. It had a kind of charm to it, with wooden details and a structure that felt like it had been there for a long time. Even though everyone called it a bungalow, it wasn't just a single-floor building. It had 2 floors and even an attic space. And our beds were on the 2nd floor, lined up in rows. During the day, it felt cozy. At night, it felt different. Before we even moved in, some of the older boys had told us stories about that bungalow. The usual kind of stories you expect in a boarding school. Things about strange sounds, sightings, and unexplained events. At the time, I didn't take them seriously. It felt like the kind of thing seniors say just to scare the younger kids. I thought it was all made up. One night, though, something happened that changed that. I woke up in the middle of the night with a problem I couldn't ignore. I needed to go to the bathroom badly. At first, I tried to ignore it. I lay there, hoping it would pass, trying to convince myself I could just hold it until morning. But it kept getting worse, and eventually I realized I had no choice. The problem was, the bathrooms were not close. They were on the ground floor, off to one side of the building. To get there, I had to leave the dorm area, walk down the stairs, pass a lonely urinal area, move through our locker room, and finally reach the actual bathroom. During the day, it was nothing. At night, it felt like a long, dark journey. I remember sitting up in bed, already feeling uneasy. The room was quiet. Everyone else asleep. The kind of silence where even small movements feel loud. I didn't want to go down there, but I had no option. So I got up and started moving as quickly as I could. As I made my way downstairs, I turned on every light I could find. I didn't care about anything else at that point. I just wanted the place to feel less dark. The lights flicked on one by one, creating small patches of safety in an otherwise shadowy space. I rushed through the locker room and into the bathroom. The bathroom itself was not a pleasant place, especially at night. It was damp, slightly musty, and had that cold feeling that makes you uncomfortable the moment you step inside. But I didn't waste any time thinking about it. I went straight in and started doing what I had come down to do. For a few moments, everything was normal. Then suddenly, the lights went out. Not dimmed, not flickered. They just shut off completely. The darkness that followed was absolute. There was no moonlight coming in, no glow from outside, nothing to soften it. It felt like the entire room had been swallowed by blackness in an instant. I froze. My heart started pounding immediately. I was still a kid, and all those stories I had heard suddenly came rushing back into my mind. Every single one of them felt real in that moment. My imagination took over in the worst way possible. But I had to get out of there. I forced myself to move, using my hands to feel around in the dark. I managed to finish up, somehow keeping myself together enough to clean up. The taps were close by, and by feeling around carefully, I even managed to wash my hands. Every second felt longer than it should have. I just wanted to get out. I slowly made my way toward where I remembered the light switch was. My hands were slightly shaking as I reached for it and tried to turn it on. Nothing happened. The light didn't come back. That made everything worse. I stepped out into the locker room, still relying on memory and touch to guide me. When I reached the locker room light switch and flipped it, the light came on instantly. For a split second, I felt relief. But that relief didn't last. The switch was right next to a large rectangular mirror mounted on the wall. As the light came on, I was facing directly toward it. And in the mirror, I saw her. A sister, standing behind me, She was close enough to be clearly visible, but not so close that I could feel her presence physically. She was wearing a traditional blue headscarf, but something about her appearance was different from the sisters I knew. Her hair, dark and black, was visible underneath the scarf, which was slightly pushed back. She looked young, much younger than the sisters we usually saw around the school. Around her neck was a rosary. It was white, not the usual blue rosaries that the other sisters carried. For a moment, I couldn't move. It felt like time had stopped completely. Then everything snapped at once. I screamed and turned around. There was no one there. The space behind me was empty. That only made it worse. I didn't wait another second. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, up the stairs, back toward the dorm. And as I was running, I noticed something that still stays with me. Behind me, the lights went off again. I hadn't touched the switch. It just went out. I didn't stop until I reached my bed. I climbed in, pulled the covers over my head, and stayed there, shaking. I couldn't sleep at all that night. Every sound felt amplified. Every movement in the building made me tense. Even hiding under the blanket didn't make me feel safe. Morning eventually came, but the fear didn't fully go away. I thought about telling someone. There was a resident sister named Agnes who lived nearby. She was older, tall, with gray hair, and known for being strict and moody. I considered telling her what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Part of me was afraid she would just dismiss it. Another part of me didn't want to be laughed at. It was an all-boys hostel. If I told my friends, I knew exactly what would happen. They would tease me endlessly, call me scared, make jokes about it. So I kept quiet. I told no one. But I never forgot what I saw. I could still picture her clearly. The black hair, that's the white rosary, the way she stood there in the mirror without moving. Then, a few weeks later, something happened that made it even harder to ignore. One of my friends told a story. He described waking up at night, going down to the bathroom, the lights going out, and then seeing a sister in the mirror. The same details, the same setting, the same sequence of events. And when he described her, it was exactly the same as what I had seen. The black hair, the slightly pushed back headscarf, the white rosary, every detail matched. I remember listening to him, feeling that same cold sensation all over again. But even then, I didn't tell him that I had seen her too. I just stayed quiet, because I had never told anyone. And somehow, that made it feel even more real. Even now, after all these years, I still remember that night clearly. Not just the fear, but the certainty of what I saw, and the fact that I wasn't the only one. When I think back to my time working in Haiti, there are moments that stay with me in very different ways. Some were difficult in the way you expect when resources are limited and the needs are overwhelming. You prepare yourself for that kind of work. You know it will be hard. You know there will be cases you can't fully solve, treatments you wish you had, outcomes you wish you could change. But there were other moments that stayed with me for a different reason. Not because they were medically complex, but because something about them didn't sit right. The kind of cases where you walk away knowing you didn't get the full story, and that whatever was hidden mattered just as much as what you could see. There's one case in particular that I still think about. A teenage girl was brought into the hospital one day. We were told she was 19, but the moment I saw her, that didn't feel accurate. She looked much younger, 15, maybe 16. It wasn't just her physical appearance, although that played a part. It was something deeper, something about how she existed in the space. She didn't carry herself like someone her age. In fact, she barely carried herself at all. She was extremely thin. Not the kind of thin we were used to seeing from malnutrition, which unfortunately was common enough. This was different. It felt like something had been wearing her down over time, slowly draining whatever strength she had. Her body looked fragile, like it wouldn't take much for it to give out completely. But it wasn't just her body. It was her face. She didn't speak. She didn't react. She didn't resist. She just stared. Her eyes were fixed somewhere distant, not focusing on anything in the room. There was a kind of quiet sadness in them, but it wasn't emotional in the way you normally see. It was steady, unchanging, like something that had settled in and stayed there for a long time. We tried to talk to her. We asked simple questions at first, hoping for any kind of response. A word, a nod, even a small reaction. Nothing. She didn't acknowledge us at all. In a setting like that, you start with what you can test and measure. Given her condition, HIV was one of the first things we considered. It was something we had to rule out early. Severe weight loss like that could be linked to it, especially if it had progressed over time. So we ran the tests we could. Blood work, platelet levels, everything available to us in that environment. But the results didn't line up with what we expected. Her levels were close to normal. If she was HIV positive, it had to be recent. Too recent to explain the physical state she was already in. The timeline didn't make sense. Whatever was happening to her had either started before that or was coming from something entirely different. From a medical standpoint, it was confusing. But what stayed with me wasn't the confusion. It was her father. Since she wasn't speaking, we had no choice but to rely on him for information. We needed context. We needed history. We needed anything that could help us understand what had led to her condition. We asked the usual questions. Was she in a relationship? Had she been sexually active? Did he know where she spent her time? Had anything changed recently? At first, he answered. But as the conversation went on, his answers started to shift. He would say one thing, then change it slightly. Then adjust it again when we asked follow-up questions. It wasn't just forgetfulness. It felt like he was trying to shape the narrative. Like he was choosing his answers carefully based on what he thought we were looking for. We had to push him to be more direct. Even then, nothing felt solid. There was something off in the way he interacted with us. He seemed uneasy, but not in the way a worried parent usually is. It didn't feel like fear for her health. It felt more controlled than that. Like he was focused on managing the situation rather than understanding it. That's when the possibility of abuse started to surface in our minds. It wasn't a conclusion, but it was enough of a concern that we couldn't ignore it. The combination of her condition, her silence, and his inconsistent answers pointed towards something deeper that we weren't being told. We decided to arrange a psychiatric evaluation. There was a building just across the courtyard where that could be done. It wasn't far. The idea was to have someone trained in that area try to reach her differently. Sometimes patients who won't respond in a medical setting will open up in a different environment with a different kind of approach. We stepped away briefly to coordinate it. It wasn't long. When we came back, they were gone. Both of them. At first, it didn't register. We assumed they had been moved or taken somewhere else. But no one had seen them leave. No one had been told anything. There was no record of discharge. They were just gone. That was the moment everything shifted. She hadn't been in a condition where she could simply walk out on her own. She barely responded to anything. There was no way she had made that decision herself. The only explanation was that her father had taken her. He must have wheeled her out quietly, without drawing attention, without informing anyone. And when you think about when it happened, it becomes harder to ignore what it might mean. He left right when we started arranging the psychiatric evaluation. Right when there was a chance someone might ask questions in a different way. Questions he wouldn't be able to control. That timing didn't feel like coincidence. It felt deliberate, like he understood what could happen next. Like he didn't want us to get any further. We never saw her again. There was no follow-up, no closure. In a place like that, people come and go. Sometimes cases simply disappear. You're left with fragments. What you saw, what you suspected, what you couldn't prove. But some cases stay with you more than others. She did. I still think about her sometimes. About the way she looked, so fragile. Like something inside her had already given up long before she arrived. About the way she didn't speak, didn't react, didn't seem fully present. And I think about him, the way he avoided direct answers, the way he seemed more concerned with controlling the situation than helping us understand it, and the way he left, quietly, at exactly the moment when things might have started to come to light. I don't know what was really happening. I don't know where she went or what her life was like after that. But I do know that something about that situation wasn't right. And even now, after all this time, that feeling hasn't gone away. I just hope that wherever she ended up, she found some kind of safety. Even if, in that moment, we weren't able to give it to her. Back when we were younger, my friends and I had this habit of exploring abandoned places around the city. It started out as something simple, just a way to kill time and do something a little different from everyone else. We weren't looking for trouble. Most of the time, we just went in, looked around, took photos, and left. There was something about those places that pulled us in. The quiet, the way time seemed frozen inside them, the feeling that you were stepping into something that had been left behind. Most of the buildings we explored were exactly what you would expect. Empty rooms, broken windows, graffiti covering the walls, floors littered with debris. Sometimes you'd find old furniture, sometimes just scraps of what used to be there. It was interesting, but never really scary. At least, not in a serious way. You might get a little uneasy if the place was too quiet, or if the wind made a noise somewhere in the building. But it was easy to brush that off. Until that one house. It was just down the road from where I was living at the time. Close enough that it didn't feel like a big deal to go check it out. From the outside, it looked like any other abandoned place. Worn down, windows broken or boarded, the kind of house people pass by without really thinking about it. Nothing about it stood out as particularly strange at first. So one day, we decided to go in. There were a few of us, just moving through it the way we always did. We stepped inside, and immediately it had that same abandoned feeling we were used to. Dust, silence, that faint smell of decay that comes from a place being left alone for too long. The walls were covered in graffiti, the layers of it, like different people had come through over time and left their mark. The floors were uneven, scattered with bits of broken wood, glass, and random objects that didn't belong anywhere anymore. We started wandering through the rooms, taking photos, pointing things out, just talking like it was any other place. Nothing felt wrong at first. Then we came into a part of the house with multiple doorways leading into different rooms. It was a bit confusing, the layout not entirely clear, like parts of the structure didn't quite line up the way you expected. But again, that's not unusual in older buildings, especially ones that have been damaged or changed over time. There was a bottle of champagne on the floor in one of the rooms. I don't know how long it had been there. It looked old, dusty, probably left behind by someone who had come through before us. It was just another object in a place full of things that didn't matter anymore. My friend Ethan kicked it. Not hard, just enough to send it rolling across the floor and through a doorway into the next room. We watched it go, not really paying much attention, just expecting it to stop somewhere out of sight. But then something happened that didn't make sense. A second later, that same bottle came rolling out of a completely different doorway behind us. We all turned at the same time. At first, it didn't register properly. It was one of those moments where your brain tries to quickly fill in a logical explanation. Maybe it had hit something and changed direction. Maybe there was some slope in the floor we hadn't noticed. Maybe we had just misjudged which doorway it went through. But the more we thought about it, the less it made sense. There was no clear path for it to come out where it did. The layout of the rooms didn't allow for that kind of movement, at least not in a straight, simple way. It should have stayed in the direction it was kicked. Still, we didn't immediately jump to anything strange. We were curious. So I tried it again. I kicked the bottle in the same direction, watching carefully this time, trying to track exactly where it went. It rolled through the doorway just like before. And then, again, it came rolling out of the doorway behind us. Exactly the same way. That was the moment everything shifted. It was still subtle, still quiet, but something about it felt wrong. Not just confusing, but wrong in a way that didn't sit well. The kind of feeling you get when something doesn't follow the rules you expect it to follow. We stood there for a second, not really knowing what to say. And then it got worse. Out of nowhere, from the doorway behind us, books came flying out. Not falling, not slipping off a shelf, flying. One after another, they were thrown out into the room with force. You could hear the weight of them as they hit the floor. They weren't light. The sound was heavy, sharp, and sudden, breaking the silence in a way that felt aggressive. There was no one there. No movement we could see. No explanation for it. That was it. There was no discussion, no trying to figure it out. We all reacted at the same time. We ran. I don't even remember who moved first. It was just instinct. That pure, automatic reaction where your body takes over and decides for you. We bolted out of the house as fast as we could, not looking back, not stopping, just getting as far away from that place as possible. I remember the feeling more than anything else. That rush of adrenaline, that cold shock running through your body. The kind of fear that doesn't need to be explained because you feel it before you can even think. We didn't stop until we were well away from the house. When we finally slowed down, there was this shared understanding between all of us. No one tried to joke about it. No one tried to explain it away. We didn't even really talk about what had just happened in detail. We just knew. Something in that house wasn't right. We never went back. Not once. Out of all the places we explored, all the abandoned buildings we walked through without a second thought, that was the only one that stayed with us in a way that made us completely avoid it afterward. Even now, thinking back on it, I still can't come up with a reasonable explanation. Maybe there was something about the structure of the house that caused the bottle to roll in a way we didn't understand. Maybe there was some hidden space or angle we couldn't see. But the books, that's the part that doesn't fit. The way they came flying out. The force behind it. The timing, right after we tried to test what we had seen. That's what makes it hard to dismiss. And that's why, even after all this time, none of us ever went anywhere near that place again.
Pardon the interruption for just a moment. I hope these stories are keeping you on the edge of your seat tonight. If you're finding yourself drawn to these dark accounts, I'd love to have you join us. If you're new here, please consider hitting that subscribe button. We share new, true horror stories every single day, and being part of the community is the only way to make sure you never miss a nightmare. A quick like and a comment also means a lot. It really helps the shadows spread a little further. But for now, let's get back to it. The darkness is calling.
I had been reading through stories like this on and off all day before I finally realized I had one of my own to share. At first, I almost didn't bother. I figured by then no one would even read it. But the memory came back so clearly that once I started thinking about it, I couldn't let it go. This happened when I moved to Columbia, South Carolina in the early 2000s. I was in high school at the time, still trying to settle into a new place, a new school, and a completely new routine. Everything felt unfamiliar back then. When you move as a teenager, even simple things can feel bigger than they really are. Every street, every house, every person feels like something you have to learn from the beginning. You notice small details because none of it belongs to your memory yet. Not long after moving there, I became friends with a couple of girls who lived in the same neighborhood as me. I was still new enough that I was grateful for that. Having a few familiar faces around made everything easier. The neighborhood itself had an older feel to it. It wasn't one of those neat, modern suburban areas where every house looks the same and everything feels recently built. These houses were smaller, older, and had that slightly worn look that comes with time. Nothing about the area was especially creepy during the day, but it had character in a way that made it feel different from other places I had lived. One thing that stood out about that part of the neighborhood was how close some of the backyards came to a set of train tracks. The tracks ran behind several homes, separated by small patches of land, trees, and weak-looking fences that didn't feel like much of a boundary at all. One of the girls I'd become friends with lived in one of those houses. Her backyard backed right up toward the tracks. There was a thin line of trees near the back, and behind them stood an old chain-link fence that was bent, damaged, and broken in places. It looked less like protection and more like something that had simply been there for too long. At the time, though, I didn't really pay much attention to it. One night, I was staying over at her house. It was just a normal sleepover, the kind of thing teenage girls do without thinking much of it. We were hanging out in her room, talking about random things, probably laughing too loudly, staying awake much later than we should have. It felt ordinary, comfortable, harmless. The kind of night that should have ended as just another memory of being young and trying to fit into a new life. At some point, it got really late, or early, depending on how you look at it. I remember it being around 3 in the morning when it happened. Out of nowhere, a train came through. The sound startled me. It was loud enough to cut through the quiet of the night, and sudden enough that it immediately grabbed my attention. I remember commenting on it, because I genuinely hadn't known the tracks were there before. I had never noticed them during the day, or maybe I had noticed them without understanding how close they actually were to the house. The train was noisy, heavy, and impossible to ignore. But it passed quickly. It was one of those short moments where the entire night shifts for a few seconds and then goes still again. I said something about how loud it was and how I hadn't realized there were tracks right there. That was when the girls looked at each other and started telling me a story. The way they told it made it feel almost rehearsed, like they knew exactly what effect it would have. They said there had been an elderly woman living down the block, someone everyone in the neighborhood knew about in one way or another. According to them, she was considered insane, a total recluse, someone who had kept to herself for years. They described her as the kind of person people whispered about, the kind of neighbor kids knew by reputation without really knowing anything real about her. They told me she had barely left her house in years. Then, one day, for no obvious reason anyone understood, she did. She walked out of her house, went down the street, crossed into my friend's yard, moved all the way to the back of the property, and crawled through a hole in that broken fence behind the trees. After that, she lay down on the train tracks and killed herself. The way they said it was so matter-of-fact that it hit harder than if they had tried to be dramatic. They pointed out the backyard, the trees, the fence, the exact area behind the house where it had supposedly happened. Suddenly, all the harmless parts of the property looked different. The darkness outside the window felt heavier. That damaged fence no longer seemed random. It felt like part of something ugly that had happened there. I remember feeling a chill run through me. I was already unsettled by being in a newer place with newer friends. And hearing that story at 3 a.m. while a train had just passed made it worse. It got in my head immediately. The image of someone crawling through the hole in that fence and making their way to the tracks stayed with me in a way I didn't like. It was one of those stories that plants itself inside your imagination so quickly that the setting around you changes because of it. At first, though, I assumed they were messing with me. That was honestly the easiest explanation. I was the new girl. We were at a sleepover. It felt exactly like the kind of creepy story people tell late at night to freak someone out. I thought they were testing me, seeing how gullible I was, or maybe just enjoying the fact that they had managed to unsettle me. I remember getting a little annoyed, not furious, not enough to start a big argument, but irritated. I didn't like feeling like the target of a prank, especially with people I had only recently started calling friends. Still, I didn't make a huge deal out of it. They were new friends, and I didn't want to turn one uncomfortable moment into something bigger. So I kinda let it go, even though I stayed uneasy the rest of the night. Every sound outside felt different after that. Every small creak of the house, every shift in the air, every distant noise seemed more noticeable. It's amazing how quickly a story can do that. One minute you're in a perfectly normal room, and the next you can't stop picturing something awful that supposedly happened right outside. The next day, I told my dad about it. I was still annoyed, and I remember telling him how the girls had tried to scare me. I explained the story they had told me and said it had pissed me off because I didn't like being made the butt of a joke. I was expecting him to laugh and agree that they had just been messing with me. But instead, he turned and looked at me in a way that immediately made me feel off. Then he said something like, "Oh, damn. No, that totally happened a couple years ago. It was all over the local news. Her backyard? Damn." I honestly thought he was joking too. The way he said it sounded almost too perfect, like maybe he was joining in just to mess with me even more. So I called bullshit on him right away. There was no way I was going to believe that story after assuming all night that it was just some creepy prank. But he didn't back down. He went and pulled up the news article online to prove it. And there it was. It was real. Although the story was true, a woman really had lived nearby. She really had left her house and gone through that yard. She really had crawled through the damaged fence and ended her life on those tracks. It hadn't been some made-up sleepover story. It had happened. The place I had just spent the night, the backyard I had barely noticed before, had been part of something tragic and horrifying. That was the moment the whole thing changed for me. It's one thing to hear a creepy story and think it's fake. It's another thing entirely to find out it actually happened. Suddenly, all the details from the night before came rushing back in a different way. The train at 3 in the morning, the darkness behind the house, the broken fence, the girls' expressions when they told me. Everything felt heavier because it was no longer just a story designed to scare me. It was history, real history tied to a real place. And what made it even worse was how ordinary that backyard looked. That's always the disturbing part with things like this. There's no sign left behind that matches the weight of what happened. The trees were just trees. The fence was just an old fence. The yard was just someone's backyard. If no one told you, you would never know. Life keeps moving around places where terrible things happened. And after enough time, they look normal again. But once you know, they never feel fully normal. After that, I couldn't think about that house the same way. I couldn't imagine that backyard without picturing the woman making her way through it in the dark. I couldn't hear about the train tracks without thinking about what had happened there. Even if nothing else strange ever happened at the house, that knowledge alone was enough to change the feeling of the place. And what stayed with me most was how easily I had dismissed it. I'd been so sure the girls were lying. So sure it was just one of those stories people tell to scare the new kid. I had felt annoyed because I thought they were making me look stupid. Then, in one quick moment, my dad proved that they hadn't made it up at all. That kind of realization sticks with you. Because then you start wondering how many other stories that sound too dark or too strange might actually be true. How many places we move through every day carry some history we know nothing about. How many quiet streets and ordinary houses have things attached to them that time doesn't erase, even when everything on the surface looks completely normal. I still remember the shock of seeing that article. It wasn't dramatic in the way movies make things dramatic. There wasn't some huge reveal or sudden twist. It was just a quiet, awful confirmation that something terrible had really happened exactly where they said it had. And somehow, that made it even scarier. Because fiction has a certain distance to it. You can put it away. You can tell yourself it's just a story. But this wasn't that. It was a real woman, a real neighborhood, a real backyard, real train tracks. And one loud train in the middle of the night was enough to bring all of it back for me in a way I've never really forgotten. My friend told me this story a long time ago. And even now, I still don't know if it really happened, or if it was one of those stories that gets passed around and grows darker every time someone tells it. But true or not, it stayed with me. Maybe because of how ordinary it starts. Maybe because nothing about it seems impossible at first. It begins like the kind of situation people find themselves in every day. With a new relationship, a family gathering, and a decision that seems small in the moment, but later feels like the point where everything changed. According to him, his family was close with another family in the neighborhood. They had known each other for years, the kind of connection where everyone was familiar with everyone else. They had been to each other's houses, celebrated birthdays together, showed up for holidays, and kept that easy level of trust people develop over time when they've lived near each other for years. Their daughter was in her 20s, old enough to be independent, but still very connected to her family. She was the kind of person who brought people around instead of hiding parts of her life. If she was seeing someone, eventually her family would know about it. At some point, she started dating a new guy. From what I heard, it was still early, not a serious long-term relationship yet, but enough that she liked him and wanted to include him in her life. There must have been something about him that felt normal enough at the time. Maybe he was charming. Maybe he knew how to act around her family. Maybe he gave off the kind of impression that made people lower their guard quickly. Whatever it was, she felt comfortable enough to invite him to a family event. That's what makes the story feel so disturbing to me. It didn't begin with obvious danger. It began with normal trust. He came to the gathering, met everyone, and from all appearances, things went smoothly. He blended in. No one noticed anything strange enough to raise alarm. He was just a new boyfriend at a social event. Another face in the room, another person laughing, drinking, talking, trying to make a good impression. As the night went on, people drank more, relaxed more, and the atmosphere shifted into that familiar warmth family events sometimes have late in the evening, when everything becomes looser and less formal. At some point, she got drunk. Not out of control, but just enough that her judgment may have been softer than usual, and the boundaries of the evening had become blurrier. Somewhere in that late-night haze, the two of them started hooking up. Nothing about that would have seemed shocking at the time. It was the kind of thing that happens when people are attracted to each other and a night runs longer than expected. But at some point, he asked her to come back to his place with him. She said no, not angrily, not dramatically, just clearly. She wanted to take things slower. She wasn't ready to go that far yet, and she told him that. From the way the story was told to me, she wasn't rejecting him completely. She just wanted more time. She wanted to wait until another night, another moment, something that felt more right to her. It was a normal choice, a smart one, and she made it respectfully. Asked him for a while. That seemed like the end of it. A few days later, though, she started to notice something wrong. At first, it may not have looked serious. A rash had developed around her lips and along her neck. It wasn't something easy to ignore. But it also wasn't immediately the kind of symptom that makes people assume something horrible is happening. People get skin reactions for all kinds of reasons. Allergies, irritation, infection, stress, even changes in weather or hygiene products can cause strange breakouts. Still, it was unusual enough that she went to the doctor. At the appointment, they examined her, probably asked questions, maybe tried to narrow it down to something common. But they couldn't figure it out. That in itself can be unsettling. Most people go to a doctor expecting at least a likely answer, even if it's simple. And instead, she left without one. No clear explanation, no easy reassurance, just uncertainty. She went home and waited. Maybe she hoped it would clear up on its own. Maybe she tried not to dwell on it. But the rash didn't go away. And before long, she got a call from the doctor's office asking her to come back in. That kind of call is enough to make anyone uneasy. When a doctor asks you to return after initially not having an answer, your mind immediately starts moving through possibilities. Most of the time, it turns out to be something manageable. But there's always that period before you know the truth, where your thoughts can go anywhere. The next day, she returned to the doctor, and her mother went with her. That detail always makes the story feel heavier. Even as an adult, when something feels serious or uncertain, people often want family close by. There's comfort in not hearing difficult news alone. So they went together and were seated in one of the exam rooms, waiting. Then the doctor called the mother outside. That moment alone says a lot. When a doctor asks to speak to a family member separately, it immediately creates dread. It suggests that whatever they're about to say is too serious, too disturbing, or too sensitive to just say casually in front of the patient without preparation. The room changes when that happens. Even if no one speaks, fear enters it. According to the story, the doctor told the mother that the rash had been caused by bacteria or maybe a virus associated with decomposing human flesh. That's the point where the story stops feeling like a medical mystery and turns into something much darker. Imagine hearing that. Imagine being the mother, standing in that hallway or office, trying to process words that shouldn't make sense in any normal situation. There aren't many explanations for something like that, and every possible one is horrifying. A rash like that is no longer just a rash. It becomes evidence of contact with something deeply wrong. Eventually, the daughter was told. I always imagine that moment as one of total disbelief. There are some things that don't register immediately because the mind resists them. You hear the words, but they don't fit into reality at first. They float there, detached, impossible. But once they settle, once they connect to a person, a memory, a recent night, the horror begins to sharpen. And for her, the connection came fast. She immediately thought of the guy. There must have been no one else. It could have been. No other explanation close enough, recent enough, or personal enough to make sense. Whatever had caused that reaction, it had likely happened through contact with him. So she called him. Maybe she was panicked, maybe angry, maybe desperate for some explanation that would make everything less terrible than it sounded. She left a voicemail, and he never called back. That silence says everything. If there had been any innocent explanation, that was the moment to offer it. But instead, nothing. No return call, no confusion, no denial. Just silence. At that point, things moved beyond private fear and into something much more serious. Police got involved. I don't know exactly how quickly it all happened in the version I heard, but eventually they got a warrant to search his house. That part of the story is where it becomes almost unbearable. And when officers entered his home, they found multiple bodies. Not one, but several. Girls roughly around her age, young women, people who had their own lives, their own families, their own routines, and who had somehow ended up inside that house, never leaving it. And then there was him. According to the story, they found him hunched over one of the bodies, eating from it. Even writing that out feels unreal. It's so extreme, so deeply violating, that it pushes past ordinary fear into something almost impossible to sit with. It's not just violence. It's not just murder. It's the total collapse of humanity. The kind of scene that changes the meaning of evil from something abstract into something physical and immediate. That image is what makes the story linger. Not because it's graphic, but because of how close she came. Not if she had gone back to his place that night, what would have happened? That question is built into the story whether anyone says it out loud or not. She declined because she wanted to take things slowly. A normal choice, a simple boundary. And that one decision may have saved her life. That's what makes it feel so chilling. The most important choices in life rarely feel dramatic when we make them. They often happen in quiet moments, in ordinary conversations, in a simple yes or no. You don't always know when you're stepping away from danger. Sometimes you only understand it later, when the truth finally comes into view. I can also imagine what the aftermath must have been like for her if the story is true. Even surviving something like that, indirectly, would leave damage behind. To find out that someone you kissed, trusted, unintroduced to your family and nearly went home with, was hiding something that monstrous would break your sense of judgment for a long time. It would make you question every instinct, every memory, every conversation. You would replay the whole night again and again, looking for signs you missed. Her family must have done the same. They had met him. They had let him into their gathering. They had treated him like a guest. That realization alone would be hard to live with, even though they couldn't have known. Evil doesn't always arrive looking dangerous. Sometimes it shows up polite, calm, smiling, and completely ordinary. That may be the part of the story that frightens people most. Not just the bodies, not just the disease, not just the horror inside the house. It's the fact that from the outside, he was apparently normal enough to pass. Normal enough to be welcomed into a family space. Normal enough that a young woman felt safe being close to him. Whether every detail of the story is true or not, that's what gives it power. It touches a fear people already have. The fear that danger can hide inside something familiar. That you can sit across from someone, talk to them, laugh with them, even feel drawn to them, and still have no idea who they really are. I still don't know if the story actually happened the way it was told to me. Stories like that often get passed around, picked up, reshaped, and told as fact even when parts of them are rumor. Over time, details blur. A bacteria or a virus becomes something from decomposing flesh. A suspicious man becomes a monster. A terrible crime becomes even more terrible with each retelling. But even with all that uncertainty, the story stays disturbing. Because at its core, it isn't really about whether every detail can be proven. It's about how close horror can come while still looking ordinary. A family event, a new boyfriend, a night of drinking, a rash, a phone call, a search warrant. Each step sounds manageable on its own, until suddenly they connect and form something awful. And by then, the world no longer feels as safe or as readable as it did before. A few months ago, I was traveling through Bucharest, and what should have been a simple overnight arrival turned into one of the strangest nights I've ever experienced. I reached the city at around 1 in the morning after spending 9 hours on a train. I hadn't slept in almost 2 days. The night before, I had to wake up extremely early to catch my train, and after that, there was no real chance to rest. By the time I arrived, my body felt completely drained. My thoughts were slow, my head felt heavy, and everything around me had that slightly unreal feeling you get when you're beyond exhausted. I was couch surfing with a guy I had connected with earlier. When I got to his place, he was kind enough to offer me some food and help me settle in. It should have been the perfect moment to finally sleep, but for some reason, I couldn't. No matter how tired I was, my body just wouldn't shut down. I lay there for a while, staring into the dark, feeling restless in a way that didn't make sense. After some time, I gave up. I told him we could meet properly in the morning and decided to go out for a walk instead. Looking back, it probably wasn't the smartest decision. It was around 2 in the morning. I didn't know the area. And I had just arrived in a part of North Bucharest that wasn't exactly known for being the safest, especially at that hour. But at the time, I didn't really think about it. I just needed to move. The air outside was freezing. It was December, and snow was falling steadily, covering the streets in a quiet white layer. The city felt empty, not completely dead, but close to it. There were long stretches where I didn't see anyone at all, just buildings and dim streetlights and the sound of my own footsteps. I had no real idea where I was going, I just knew I wanted to reach the old city area. At some point, I came across a police officer and asked for directions. He pointed me toward the center and told me it was about an hour away on foot. An hour didn't sound like much at the time. So I started walking. The snow kept falling, and the streets became quieter the further I went. There was something about the atmosphere that felt slightly off. Not dangerous exactly, but strange. The kind of feeling where you start to notice every little detail because there's nothing else to distract you. Eventually, I reached a highway underpass. That's when I saw them. A group of stray dogs. There were quite a few of them, maybe around 10, scattered around the area. At first, like they were just lying there or moving slowly, not paying much attention. But the moment they noticed me, everything changed. One by one, they got up, and then they started barking. Not just a few barks, but loud, aggressive, continuous barking. The kind that immediately puts you on edge. They began moving closer, slowly forming a loose circle around me. Their posture changed, their bodies tense, their focus completely on me. I kept walking, trying not to panic. But they kept closing in. The growling got louder, deeper. I could feel the tension building with every step I took. My heart started racing, and I realized how vulnerable I was in that moment. There was no one around, no easy way out, just me and this pack of dogs that clearly didn't see me as something neutral. Then one of them charged. It came at me suddenly, us barking aggressively, jumping forward like it was about to attack. Without thinking, I reacted. I kicked out, hitting it in the face. It yelped and fell back, and for a split second, everything paused. Then the rest of them scattered. Just like that. The tension broke, and they ran off, disappearing into the darkness around the underpass. I didn't stop walking. I just kept going, trying to steady my breathing, trying to shake off what had just happened. A little while later, I came across a teenager. He looked out of place, just standing there in the middle of the night. It was strange to see someone his age out at that hour, especially in that area. I asked him for directions. He told me the old city was still far away. His tone was calm, but there was something about the way he looked at me that felt slightly off. Not threatening, but just distant. Then he said, "Well, good luck, my friend. Be careful." There was something about the way he said it that stuck with me. I turned away for just a second, adjusting my direction, and when I looked back, he was gone. Completely gone. The street behind me was empty. At the time, I didn't think too deeply about it. I told myself he must have just walked off quickly, maybe turned a corner I hadn't noticed. So I kept going. About 15 minutes later, I started to feel like I was getting lost. The streets all looked the same, and my sense of direction wasn't exactly reliable in the state I was in. That's when I saw an older man walking slowly ahead of me. I approached him and asked for directions. He stopped, and then he just stared at me. Not for a second or two. For a long time. It felt like at least 30 seconds, maybe more. There was no expression on his face, just this fixed gaze that made me uncomfortable. I didn't know what he was thinking or why he wasn't responding. And then, suddenly, he started laughing. Loud, uncontrolled. The kind of laughter that doesn't sound normal, that doesn't sound like it's coming from a place of humor. It echoed in the empty street, sharp and unsettling. I didn't wait for anything else. I just stepped back and walked away, trying not to show how uncomfortable I felt. A bit further on, I ran into another man. He approached me this time, asking for a cigarette. I gave him one, and we stood there for a moment while he smoked. I asked him for directions, and he explained clearly where I needed to go. He seemed normal, calm, helpful. But then, just as we were about to part ways, he said something. "Good luck to you, my friend." The exact same words. Something about that hit differently this time. I nodded, turned to continue walking, and after a second, I glanced back. He was gone. No footsteps, no sign of him. Just an empty street again. At that point, I started to feel a little unsettled. There was a pattern for me, something I couldn't quite explain, but I pushed it aside. I told myself I was just tired, that my mind wasn't processing things properly. Eventually, I reached the old city. It felt completely different from where I had been. There were lights, buildings closer together, a sense of life returning to the environment. I found a coffee machine, grabbed something hot, and sat down on a corner, trying to relax for a moment. That's when a young girl approached me. She looked at me for a second and said, "You're not from Bucharest, are you?" I told her I wasn't. We talked briefly, just small conversation, nothing unusual. Then she asked me for some money for coffee. It seemed harmless enough, so I gave her some. She smiled slightly, then said something that made everything inside me go still. "Be careful out here. It's a very strange place. Good luck to you, my friend." The same words. Again. I barely had time to react. She turned and walked away, and within seconds, she was gone. I sat there for a while after that, holding my coffee, trying to process everything that had happened. The night felt different now. Not just strange, but layered in a way I couldn't fully explain. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe my mind was connecting things that weren't really connected. But the repetition, the timing, like the way each person appeared and disappeared so quickly, it all felt too consistent to ignore. Even now, when I think back on that night, I don't know what to make of it. Maybe I was just too tired, too out of it to see things clearly. Or maybe, for a few hours, I walked through a version of the city that didn't quite follow the same rules as everything else. Either way, it's a night I've never been able to fully explain, and one I've never been able to forget. When my friend and I first moved into that place, it felt like we had stepped into a completely different world. It wasn't just a new house. It was the kind of location that made you feel cut off from everything else. There were no close neighbors, no steady traffic, no background noise of people living their lives nearby. Our house stood alone, surrounded by open land that stretched out in every direction. In the distance, there were a few old buildings, abandoned and worn down, like they had been left behind years ago and forgotten. During the day, it actually felt peaceful. There was something calm about being away from everything. Quiet didn't seem strange when the sun was out. It felt like space, like freedom, like you could finally breathe without constant noise around you. But at night, and that same quiet felt completely different. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt heavy. The silence seemed to press in from all sides. Every small sound carried further than it should have. The wind brushing through the bushes sounded louder, more noticeable. The porch creaked in a way that made you stop and listen. Even your own movements felt amplified, like the house was aware of everything happening inside it. You became more alert without meaning to. More aware, even when there was nothing there. It didn't take long for that feeling to settle in. but we still tried to treat it like any other place. We built small routines to make it feel normal. One of those routines was sitting out on the porch late at night. It became something we did almost every evening. Around 1 in the morning, we would step outside, light a cigarette, and then sit there for a while. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't. Sometimes we just listened to the quiet and tried to ignore how strange it felt. That night started exactly the same way. The air was cold and still. There was no wind, no movement, nothing to break the silence. The darkness stretched out around the house in every direction, thick and deep. The only real light came from the porch behind us, casting a soft glow that didn't reach very far. Beyond that, everything was shadow. There were hedges along part of the house, and a narrow walkway leading up to the porch. Past that, the land opened up, fading into darkness. You could see just enough to make out shapes, but not enough to feel certain about what you were looking at. It was the kind of darkness that played tricks on your eyes if you stared too long. We were sitting there, talking about something I don't even remember now, when my friend suddenly stopped. She didn't say anything at first. She just went quiet. I noticed it immediately, the way her voice cut off mid-sentence. When I looked at her, she wasn't looking at me anymore. Her eyes were fixed on something out near the walkway. Then she spoke. "What is that?" There was something in her voice that made my stomach drop before I even turned to look. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't confusion. It was something else. Something closer to fear. I followed her gaze, trying to focus on the darkness ahead of us. At first, I didn't see anything. Just shadows blending into each other. But then something shifted. A movement. Subtle at first. Like the kind of thing you almost miss if you're not paying attention. My eyes tried to adjust. I'm trying to separate what I was seeing from the darkness around it. And then it stepped forward. Not quickly. Slowly, like it had always been there, just hidden. And now it was choosing to show itself. Before I could fully process what I was looking at, a light snapped on. A flashlight. But it wasn't pointed at us. It was pointed upward, right at the face of whatever was standing there. The light hit from below, casting shadows in all the wrong places, distorting every feature. It made the face look unnatural, almost unreal, like something that didn't belong in a normal setting. And that's when we saw it clearly. A clown, but not the kind you see at parties or in harmless costumes. This one felt wrong the second you looked at it. The face didn't move. The expression stayed fixed, stretched in a way that didn't feel human. The light from below made the eyes look darker, deeper, like they were staring straight through you. It didn't say anything. It didn't make any sudden moves. It just started walking toward us, slow, steady, deliberate, like it knew exactly where we were and didn't need to rush. For a moment, everything inside me locked up. It didn't feel real. It felt like something pulled out of a nightmare and placed right in front of us. Something that didn't belong in that quiet, empty space. Then the fear hit all at once. We both screamed. It wasn't planned. It wasn't controlled. It just came out. At the same time, we jumped to our feet and ran inside. I remember the sound of the door slamming behind us, louder than anything else in that moment. My hands were shaking so much it was hard to get the lock, but I managed it. Then I checked it again, just to be sure, like somehow it might not be enough. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my chest and my throat. It was hard to breathe properly, like my body hadn't caught up with what was happening yet. We didn't think about it. We just called the police. Trying to explain what we had seen was harder than I expected. Even as I was saying it, it sounded unreal. A clown standing in the dark, walking toward us with a flashlight pointed at its own face. It didn't sound like something that actually happens. The dispatcher didn't take us seriously at first. You could hear it in their tone. They thought we were joking, or maybe that we were confused or not fully sober. The situation didn't sound believable to them. But we kept insisting. We told them everything, exactly how it happened. Eventually, they agreed to send someone. The time we spent waiting felt much longer than it probably was. We stayed inside, away from the windows, not wanting to look outside again. Every small noise made us tense. Every sound felt like it could mean something. When the officer finally arrived, I expected some kind of relief, but it didn't come. He listened to what we said, asked a few basic questions, and then stopped. There was no urgency in him, no real concern. He didn't go out to check the area. He didn't search around the house. He didn't even seem particularly interested. After taking our statement, he just left. That made everything feel worse. It felt like we were being left alone with something no one else believed was real. For the next few days, we didn't go outside at night. We avoided the porch completely. Even during the day, the place didn't feel the same anymore. Every time we looked toward the walkway, we remembered that moment. The way the figure had appeared. The way that light had turned on. About a week later, something happened that made everything feel even more real. There was one abandoned building nearby that we had never paid much attention to before. It had always just been there, part of the background. But that day, for some reason, we went closer. The door was slightly open. That alone was enough to make us uneasy. When we stepped closer, we saw it. A butcher knife, driven into the door, not resting there, not placed carefully. Stabbed in with force, the blade buried deep into the wood. It looked fresh, not something that had been there for years. That was when the fear settled in properly. This wasn't just something we had imagined. There had been someone out there, someone real, and they had been close. After that, everything changed. Nights became unbearable. Every sound outside felt like it meant something. Every shadow seemed like it might move if you looked at it long enough. Then, a few months later, we saw something in the newspaper. It was a man. Someone breaking into houses. He dressed as a clown. And he wasn't just scaring people. He had killed. More than once. And some of it had happened not far from where we were living. Reading that made everything fall into place in the worst way possible. The figure we saw that night. The knife in the abandoned building. The feeling that something had been out there watching us. It all connected. It wasn't random. It wasn't a joke. It was real. And even now, when I think back to that night, like what stays with me the most isn't just what we saw. It's how close it all was. How easily things could have gone differently. And how sometimes the things that feel too strange to be real turn out to be exactly that. Jill had taken babysitting jobs before, but this one felt different from the moment she pulled into the driveway. It was her first time working for this family, and as she slowed her car and looked up at the house, she actually had to check the address again just to make sure she hadn't made a mistake. The house didn't look like a normal home. It was huge, not just big in the way some houses are, but the kind of place that felt closer to a mansion. The structure stood tall against the cold night sky, its windows glowing softly from the inside. The property stretched out around it, wide and open, with a long driveway that made the house feel even more distant from everything else. Snow had fallen the night before, covering the ground in a clean, untouched layer of white. It gave the whole place a quiet, almost peaceful feeling. But what stood out to her was the snowman in the front yard. It had already been built, even though the snow was fresh. It looked slightly uneven, like it had been made quickly, but it was there, facing the house. Jill sat in her car for a moment longer than she needed to. Something about the place made her pause, but she shook it off. It was probably just nerves. First night, new house, new family. That kind of thing always made people a little uneasy. She stepped out of the car, the cold air hitting her immediately, and walked up to the front door. Her boots pressed into the snow with soft crunching sounds. She knocked, and within a few seconds, the door opened. Mrs. Wilson greeted her with a warm smile. She seemed kind, calm, the type of person who immediately makes you feel a little more at ease. She invited Jill inside, and the warmth of the house replaced the cold from outside. The interior was just as impressive as the outside. Everything was clean, organized, and spacious, with soft lighting that made the rooms feel comfortable. Mrs. Wilson gave her a quick tour of the house, pointing out where everything was. The living room, the kitchen, the kids' rooms upstairs. She didn't rush, but she didn't take too long either. It felt like she had done this before. Then she introduced Jill to the children, Tim and Maggie. They were polite, quiet, and surprisingly well-behaved. They greeted Jill without any fuss and then went back to what they had been doing, playing quietly with their toys. There was no chaos, no running around. None of the things Jill had experienced with other babysitting jobs. Mrs. Wilson handed Jill a piece of paper with a phone number on it. She explained that it was where she and her husband could be reached if anything came up. She also mentioned that the kids needed to be in bed by 10. After that, she thanked Jill again, grabbed her coat and left. The house felt different once she was gone. Not empty exactly, but quieter. Jill stood there for a moment, listening. The faint sound of the kids playing upstairs, the low hum of the house itself. Everything seemed normal. She decided to relax a little. Since the kids were keeping to themselves, she went into the living room and turned on the TV. A game show was on, one of her favorites. The familiar sounds and bright colors helped settle her nerves. She sat back on the couch, letting herself relax into the routine of the evening. Time passed slowly but comfortably. Every now and then, she would glance toward the stairs just to make sure everything was okay. But there were no problems. No noise, no trouble. It was one of the easiest babysitting jobs she had ever had. Around 10 o'clock, she turned off the TV and went upstairs. The hallway was softly lit, the kind of lighting that makes everything feel calm. She checked on Tim and Maggie, gently reminding them that it was time for bed. They listened without argument, climbing into their beds and settling down quickly. Jill stayed for a minute, making sure they were comfortable, before quietly leaving the room and heading back downstairs. She turned the TV back on, but this time, something was different. Her game show was gone. Instead, the screen showed breaking news. The tone had shifted completely. The bright, yet cheerful atmosphere of the show had been replaced with something tense. The reporter spoke quickly, seriously. A serial killer had escaped from prison. He was believed to be in the area. They showed his picture on the screen. His face stayed there for a few seconds, long enough to make it stick in her mind. They warned viewers to be cautious, to lock their doors, to stay alert. The man was considered armed and extremely dangerous. Jill felt a chill run through her. The house suddenly didn't feel as warm as it had before. She glanced toward the windows, then toward the doors. Everything seemed normal, but the feeling of unease had settled in. She couldn't ignore it. So she got up. She walked through the house, checking every door and every window, making sure everything was locked properly. She double-checked the back door, the side windows, even the small locks she might have ignored earlier. Once she was satisfied, she went back to the living room. She sat down again, trying to focus on the TV, trying to push the uneasy feeling away. That's when she noticed it. At first, it was just something small. A shape, a movement in the large window behind the TV. She wasn't even fully aware of it at first. It was something her eyes caught without her meaning to look. But once she saw it, she couldn't ignore it. She turned slightly, and then she saw him, standing outside, right there, beyond the glass, the same man from the TV, the escaped killer. He was just standing there, facing the house, holding a knife. Jill's heart dropped. For a second, she couldn't move. The image didn't feel real. It felt like something from the TV, like something that wasn't supposed to exist right in front of her. Then she screamed. The sound broke through the silence of the house, loud and sharp. Her hands shook as she grabbed the phone and called the police, trying to explain what she had seen. They responded immediately. Within minutes, multiple squad cars arrived. The flashing lights lit up the snow outside, turning the quiet yard into something tense and chaotic. Officers spread out, searching the area around the house, moving carefully, looking for any sign of the man. Jill stayed inside, her eyes fixed on the window, her body tense. But something didn't make sense. After a while, the officers came back with nothing. No sign of him. No movement. No evidence that anyone had been there at all. And then they pointed something out. The snow. It was still untouched, and there were no footprints. If someone had been standing outside that window, there would have been marks in the snow. Clear, visible signs. But there was nothing. Just a smooth, unbroken layer of white. That didn't make sense. Jill tried to explain what she'd seen, but the words didn't sound right anymore. It didn't fit with what they were telling her. So the officers decided to check the house. They moved through each room carefully, one by one, making sure nothing had been overlooked. Everything seemed fine at first, until they went upstairs. Jill followed behind them, her heart beating harder with every step. The hallway felt different now. The quiet from earlier didn't feel calm anymore. It felt heavy. They reached the kid's room, and when they opened the door, they found him, standing inside, close to the beds, not just staring at the children, not moving, not speaking, just watching. The room felt frozen in that moment, and that's when it finally made sense. Jill hadn't seen him outside. There had been no one standing in the snow. What she had seen in the window wasn't someone outside looking in. It was his reflection. He had been inside the house the entire time, standing behind her. My friend used to tell me, long before I ever experienced anything myself, that his house wasn't right. He didn't say it in a dramatic way, and he didn't try to scare people with it. He would just mention it casually sometimes, like it was something he had gotten used to living with. He said strange things had been happening there for a long time. Not small noises you could ignore, not the kind of stuff you could easily explain away, but things that didn't make sense no matter how you looked at them. According to him, it all started after he messed around with a Ouija board. He told me they had used it one night just for fun, the way people usually do. There was no real belief behind it. It was more about curiosity, something to laugh about afterward. Nothing serious, nothing they expected to lead to anything real. But after that night, things in the house changed. At first, it was small. Little things that didn't seem important on their own. Sounds at odd times, things being slightly out of place. Moments where the house felt different for no clear reason. He didn't think much of it in the beginning. It's easy to ignore things like that, especially when you don't want to believe they mean anything. Eventually, though, it became harder for him to ignore. He said the house started to feel occupied in a way that didn't make sense. Not like someone was physically there, but like something was present. Something that moved around. Something that made itself known in ways that couldn't be explained by normal causes. At some point, he got rid of the Ouija board. He told me he thought that would fix everything, that whatever had started would stop once the board was gone. But it didn't. If anything, whatever had begun seemed to stay. It didn't get better. It just became part of the house. When he first told me all of this, I didn't really believe him. I thought he was either exaggerating or just letting his imagination run too far. Houses make noise, especially older ones. Pipes knock, floors creak, things settle. When you're alone, or when it's quiet, those sounds can feel bigger than they actually are. It's easy to turn normal things into something they're not. So I listened, but I didn't take it seriously. That changed the night I stayed over. It was supposed to be a normal night. I had been to his place plenty of times before. We were just hanging out like we always did, watching football, talking, doing nothing out of the ordinary. We were sitting in his living room on the ground floor, kind of focused on the game, relaxed, not thinking about anything strange. The house felt calm, still, quiet in a normal way. Then, without warning, that quiet broke. We both heard it at the same time. Footsteps, coming from the basement. Not light footsteps. Not the kind you could mistake for something falling or shifting. These were heavy, deep. Each step sounded like it carried weight, like something large was moving across the concrete floor below us. The sound wasn't just contained to the basement. It traveled upward, through the structure of the house, into the floor beneath us. You could feel it. That was the part that made it worse. It wasn't just a sound you heard. It was something that seemed to move through the house, step by step, slow and deliberate. It went on for several seconds, each step clear, but each one spaced out enough to be unmistakable. I remember sitting there, trying to understand what I was hearing. My mind immediately went to the simplest explanation. Someone had to be down there. Maybe someone had come into the house without us realizing it. Maybe there was something we hadn't thought of yet. But when I looked at my friend, his reaction didn't match what I was feeling at all. He didn't panic. He didn't jump up. He didn't even look surprised. He just glanced toward the basement for a second and then looked back at the TV like it was nothing. I asked him what that was. He said it was normal, that it happened sometimes. That answer made everything worse. There was something unsettling about how calm he was. It wasn't just that he wasn't scared. It was that he had accepted it, like it was part of his life, as something he had already stopped questioning. We tried to ignore it after that. We kept watching the game, pretending everything was fine. The footsteps stopped, and for a few minutes, the house went quiet again. That same stillness came back, but it didn't feel the same anymore. There was tension now, something sitting just beneath the surface. And then it happened again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the basement. It was right there with us. Every chair around his kitchen table started moving. Not slowly, not slightly. They moved all at once, sliding across the wooden floor like something had pushed them hard. The sound was loud, sharp, and sudden. The scraping of the legs against the floor echoed through the room in a way that made it impossible to ignore. We both turned at the same time and just stared. The chairs kept moving for a moment, shifting out of place as if something unseen was dragging them. There was no one near them, nothing touching them, nothing that could explain it. That was the moment everything changed. Before that, there was still room to doubt. You could tell yourself it was something explainable, something you just hadn't figured out yet. But not anymore. There was no explanation that made sense. We didn't even try. We just sat there for a second, completely still, watching something we couldn't understand. I could feel my heart racing, that cold feeling spreading through my chest, the kind that makes your body tense without you even realizing it. Neither of us wanted to stay in that room. The ground floor suddenly felt wrong, too open, too exposed, like whatever was happening had space to move around freely. So we made a decision. We went down to the basement. Looking back, it doesn't make much sense. But at the time, it felt like the right thing to do. Maybe because we thought being closer to where it started would give us some kind of control. Maybe because the basement felt smaller, more contained. We didn't talk about it. We just moved. We headed for the stairs and started going down. The moment we did, the feeling changed again. The air felt heavier. The silence felt deeper, like we were stepping into something instead of just walking into a room. As soon as we reached the bottom of the stairs, everything happened at once. The lights went out. Complete darkness. Before we could react, the TV turned on by itself. The sudden light from the screen filled the room just enough to see shapes around us. It flickered slightly, casting shadows that didn't feel still. The light didn't make things better. It made everything worse. Then came the sound. Not footsteps this time. Something else. Boxes, stacked along the walls. They started falling, one after another. Not like they had been unstable. Not like they had slipped. They dropped hard, like something had pushed them. Each crash echoed through the basement, loud and sharp, filling the space with noise. It felt chaotic, uncontrolled, like something was happening all around us at once. That was it. There was no thinking anymore, no trying to understand. We just reacted. We turned and ran. Up the stairs, through the house, and straight out the front door. We didn't stop. We didn't look back. We just kept moving until we were outside, far enough away that the house didn't feel like it was right behind us. When we finally stopped, we were both breathing hard, trying to calm down, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no easy explanation. Nothing about that night felt normal. Nothing about it could be explained as imagination or coincidence. And what stayed with me the most wasn't just what I saw or heard. It was the fact that for my friend, this wasn't new. This was something he had been living with. Something that had started with a moment he probably thought didn't matter. Even now, when I think back to that night, what sticks with me is how quickly everything changed. How we went from sitting there watching football, completely relaxed, to running out of that house without even thinking, and how real it all felt in that moment. Real enough that once we were outside, neither of us had any desire to ever go back in again.
I remember this moment clearly, even though on the surface, It might not sound like the kind of story that scares people. Nothing violent happened, no one chased me, and everything ended without any real incident. But sometimes the tension of a moment is enough to stay with you for years. When you are actually in the middle of a situation like that, every second feels heavy, and your mind becomes very aware of everything happening around you. At the time, I was still in high school. I was a white kid growing up in a comfortable suburb outside of St. Louis. My neighborhood was quiet and relatively safe, the kind of place where people left their bikes in the yard and didn't worry too much about what might happen overnight. Life there felt predictable. Most of the people around me had similar backgrounds, and the streets were familiar and calm. Despite being young, I had a small job running errands for a business located in downtown St. Louis. The owners trusted me to drive around the city picking up supplies, dropping off paperwork, or grabbing things that the office needed. Because I did these errands often, I had become pretty familiar with the layout of the city. I knew which streets connected where and which areas were easy to navigate. St. Louis, like many cities, has neighborhoods that feel very different from one another. Some parts are busy and commercial, others are residential, and some areas have a reputation for being rougher or less safe. Even though I knew that certain parts of the city were considered dangerous, I had never personally experienced anything serious while running errands. One day my boss asked me to pick up something from a locksmith shop. It sounded like a simple job, just another quick stop before heading back to the office. I grabbed the address and got into the car without thinking much about it. When I looked up the location, I realized the locksmith was in a part of the city that had a pretty bad reputation. People often describe that area as one of the rougher neighborhoods in St. Louis. Even so, I wasn't overly worried. The city as a whole had areas that people casually described as ghetto, but I had driven through plenty of neighborhoods like that before without any trouble. My plan was simple. I figured I could pull up right in front of the shop, run inside quickly, grab the keys my boss needed, and then drive straight back to work. When I reached the area, though, things didn't go exactly as planned. The locksmith shop was located just off a busy main road. Cars were constantly moving along that street, and there were very few places to stop or park. I drove past the shop once and realized there was nowhere I could pull over safely, so I kept driving until I could find a place to park in a nearby neighborhood. After a minute or two, I spotted an open spot along the side of the street and pulled over. It wasn't directly next to the shop, but it wasn't terribly far either. I figured I could just walk the short distance and be done with the errand in a few minutes. When I stepped out of the car and started walking, I began to notice how quiet the neighborhood felt. The houses looked worn down and there weren't many people outside. The streets had that uneasy feeling you sometimes get in unfamiliar places where you suddenly become very aware that you stand out. I kept walking toward the main street where the locksmith shop was located. As I approached an intersection with a stop sign, I heard a car coming up the road behind me. The sound of the engine caught my attention because it was moving much faster than most cars would on a small neighborhood street. I glanced back for a moment and saw a white sedan speeding down the road. It looked like it was going around 40 miles per hour, even though the speed limit was probably closer to 20. Loud rap music blasted from the car's speakers, echoing off the quiet houses around us. The car was heading straight toward the stop sign at the intersection where I was about to cross. Wow, for a second, I honestly thought the driver might blow right through it. But just before reaching the sign, the car slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched loudly as the car came to a sudden stop. It was one of the fastest stops I had ever seen, going from high speed to completely still in a matter of seconds. The abrupt noise made my heart jump. I kept walking, trying not to show any reaction. My instinct told me it was probably best not to stare or draw attention to myself. I just focused on continuing toward the locksmith shop like nothing unusual had happened. But then I heard someone speak from inside the car. One of the men inside yelled something out the window, his voice sharp and aggressive. He asked what I thought I was doing in that neighborhood. The words were directed straight at me. I turned my head slightly and saw the people inside the sedan more clearly. There were 4 large men sitting in the car, all looking directly at me. The music had lowered just enough that I could hear the tension in the man's voice. For a brief moment, my mind went completely blank. I was a young kid walking alone in an unfamiliar neighborhood, being stared down by 4 grown men in a car that had just screeched to a halt beside me. It was one of those moments where time seems to slow down and your brain tries to decide what to do. Strangely, instead of panicking, I answered calmly. Without really thinking about it, I told them that I was just heading to the locksmith shop to pick up some keys for my job. The words came out quickly but clearly. After I said that, the man who had spoken stared at me for a few seconds. It felt like much longer than it probably was. No one else in the car said anything during that moment. Finally, he spoke again. He told me that I was in a really rough part of town. His tone had changed slightly. It wasn't friendly exactly, but it wasn't as aggressive as before either. I think he said something else about being careful or watching myself, though I honestly can't remember the exact words anymore. All I remember is nodding slightly and saying something simple like, "Okay." Then I kept walking. I didn't run or rush. I just continued down the sidewalk toward the locksmith shop, as if everything was normal. Inside, though, my heart was beating much faster than usual. I reached the shop a minute later, went inside, and picked up the keys my boss needed. The entire interaction there was completely ordinary, which felt almost surreal after what had just happened outside. Once I had the keys, I walked back to my car the same way I had come. The white sedan was gone by then. The street was quiet again. I got into my car, drove back to the office, and finished the rest of my workday like nothing unusual had happened. Later that afternoon, my boss asked me how the errand went. I simply told him that everything was fine. I never explained what had actually happened during that walk. Looking back on it now, the situation could have gone in many different directions. Maybe those men were just curious about why a kid like me was walking through their neighborhood. Maybe they were just messing around. Or maybe they were warning me in their own way that I shouldn't be wandering through that area alone. Whatever the case was, it was one of those moments that sticks with you. It taught me how quickly a simple errand can turn into a tense situation, especially when you find yourself somewhere unfamiliar and out of place. Nothing bad ended up happening that day, but I still remember that moment at the stop sign, the screech of the brakes, and the 4 faces staring at me from inside the car. And sometimes that kind of tension is enough to stay in your memory for a very long time. It happened sometime around 2001, during a period when my family life was still very different from what it later became. Back then, my mom and dad were still married, and we were all living together in the same house. Life felt stable and ordinary in the way childhood homes often do. We had our routines, our daily habits, and the small traditions that quietly shape family life. Looking back now, it feels like a simple time, the kind of time you only realize was special years later. Among all the memories from those years, there is one small moment that always stood out in our family conversations. It was not dramatic or frightening in the way some stories are. Nothing exploded, no one screamed, and no visible figure appeared. Yet the strange timing of what happened that morning left such an impression that it stayed in everyone's mind for years afterward. Even today, when someone in the family brings it up, people still pause for a moment and think about it carefully before continuing the story. The morning itself started quietly. My parents had woken up very early before the sun had fully risen. They had always liked peaceful mornings, especially when the weather was calm. early mornings gave them a chance to talk and relax before the responsibilities of the day began. On that particular day, they decided not to stay inside the house. Instead, they stepped outside and sat together on the front porch to watch the sunrise. Our house faced east, which meant the front porch was actually the perfect place to watch the sky change colors as the sun came up. In the early moments before sunrise, the sky often turns soft shades of purple and gray, slowly blending into pale orange and gold. It was something my parents enjoyed watching together whenever they had the chance. The neighborhood was still asleep at that hour. It was the kind of calm you only experience very early in the morning. There were no cars driving by, no children playing, and no neighbors moving around yet. The air was cool and quiet, and the world felt peaceful in a way that is hard to describe unless you have experienced it yourself. My parents sat there talking softly while they waited for the sun to rise. From where they were sitting, they had a clear view of the front door of the house. The doorbell was mounted right beside the doorframe, and a short walkway led from the porch down toward the yard and the sidewalk beyond it. Anyone approaching the house would have to walk right past them, or at least come clearly into view. That small detail is what made the next moment so strange. Without any warning, the doorbell suddenly rang. The sound cut through the quiet morning sharply. Doorbells have a way of grabbing your attention immediately, especially when the world around you is silent. My parents both turned their heads toward the door at the same time, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was no one. The doorway was empty. The walkway leading up to the porch was empty as well. For a second, they simply stared at the door in confusion. Since they had been sitting there the entire time, they knew that no one had approached the house. If someone had walked up to press the doorbell, they would have seen them clearly. Still, people naturally look for simple explanations first. My parents glanced around the yard, thinking maybe someone had run up quickly, pressed the bell as a prank, and then run away before being noticed. Sometimes kids in neighborhoods play games like that. But this was extremely early in the morning. Most people were still asleep, and the street itself was quiet. There were no kids outside and no one moving nearby. My dad stood up and walked toward the front steps just to check the area. He looked around the porch, down the path, and toward the yard. Everything looked exactly the same as it had moments before. There was no one there. Eventually, my parents decided that the most likely explanation was a simple malfunction. Doorbells are electrical devices, and sometimes wiring problems can cause them to behave oddly. A loose connection, moisture in the system, or a small electrical issue could occasionally trigger the bell unexpectedly. So after a brief moment of confusion, they shrugged it off. They returned to their seats and continued watching the sunrise together. The sky slowly brightened as the sun came up, and the neighborhood began to wake. Birds started to chirp, distant cars began moving along the roads, and the day unfolded like any other normal morning. The strange doorbell moment faded into the background of their minds as the hours passed. Later that day, however, something happened that brought the memory of that moment back in a very unexpected way. My dad received a phone call that carried some sad news. One of his old friends from high school had passed away. This was someone he had known for a very long time. Even though years had gone by since their school days, they had managed to stay in touch through the different stages of life. They did not see each other constantly, but they still spoke often enough to maintain a real friendship. The news hit my dad hard. When someone you have known for many years suddenly passes away, it always leaves you with a strange feeling. You begin thinking about old memories, conversations, and moments you shared together. Naturally, my dad asked when his friend had died. As the details were discussed, a small piece of information came up that immediately caught his attention. The time of his friend's passing was almost exactly the same time the doorbell had rung that morning. When my dad realized that, The strange event from earlier suddenly felt much more significant. The doorbell had rung unexpectedly while no one was near the house, and it had happened at the same moment his friend had passed away. It was a detail that gave him an uneasy feeling. Coincidences happen all the time in life, of course. People experience random events every day, but sometimes the timing of two separate moments lines up in such a precise way that it becomes difficult not to think about it. What made the situation even more unusual was that the doorbell had never done anything like that before. It had never rung by itself randomly at any other time. Even after that day, it never happened again. That single moment remained the only time the doorbell ever rang, without someone actually pressing the button. My dad checked the wiring later, just to see if there was any obvious problem. Everything appeared normal. The doorbell continued working perfectly every day after that. Over time, the story became something our family would occasionally talk about. Whenever it came up, people would share their thoughts about what might have caused it. Some believed it was simply a coincidence combined with a small electrical glitch. Others felt that the timing was just a little too perfect. It is one of those moments that sits somewhere between ordinary life and mystery. On the surface, nothing dramatic happened. A doorbell rang and no one was there. But when that small event lined up exactly with the moment someone important had passed away, it suddenly felt different. Maybe it truly was just an electrical malfunction that happened at the same time as an unrelated event. Or maybe it was one of those strange moments life occasionally gives us, where two separate things happen together in a way that feels almost meaningful. Whatever the truth may be, that quiet morning stayed in my parents' memory for a long time. Even now, years later, the story still makes people stop and think for a moment. Because sometimes the smallest moments end up becoming the ones we remember the most. Thank you for spending your night with me. I hope these lullabies stay with you, but not too close. If you found these stories chilling, please like the video and subscribe to join the family. Every comment and sub helps us keep the darkness growing. Get as comfortable as you can, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Sweet dreams.